Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Luncheon's keynote address. My name is Hans-Ulrich Meister. I'm the head of Wealth Management Private Banking Division and the CEO of Region Switzerland for Credit Suisse. It's my honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker, José Manuel Barroso, former President of the European Commission and former Prime Minister of Portugal. Great to have you here. I'm not on. The session will be facilitated by Sir John Major. Sir John is a senior advisor to Credit Suisse and, of course, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Before I proceed, let me just say how grateful we are to have President Barroso for being here with us. For a decade, until the end of October last year, President Barroso headed the EU Commission, successfully shepherding the continent through some of the darkest hours, including the near breakup of the Eurozone. Prior to this cabinet appointment and from 1999, he was elected and re-elected 3 times as the president of the PSD, that's the Partido Social Democrata Party in Portugal. During the same period, he also served as vice president of the European People's Party, and under his leadership, the PSD won the general election in 2002, and he was appointed Prime Minister of Portugal in April of that year. President Barroso has been awarded numerous honorary degrees and has received over 60 decorations, prizes, and distinctions. He is the author of numerous publications of political science, international relations, and the European Union. His strong track record in both the worlds of politics and academia leaves President Barroso well placed to discuss the prospects for Europe and whether it will succeed in striking the balance between sustainable growth, fiscal rigor, and structural reform. Leading the session today, we have Sir John Major, a distinguished politician in his own right, who as former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom oversaw many economic reforms, significantly improving the competitiveness of the UK. He had a long and successful political career, including winning the general election of 1992 with the highest number of votes ever obtained by any political party in the UK. As well as advising Credit Suisse clients, Sir John holds a number of other business appointments and serves as president and patron of a number of charities, both in the UK and internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, with 2 speakers who have such strong credentials, I look forward to a fascinating discussion this afternoon. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to President Barroso and Sir John Major.
So, well, thank you very much for your extremely kind words. Let me say how much I'm happy to be with you today here in Hong Kong, to be in the company of Sir John Major. In fact, we were just speaking now, it's almost a quarter of a century that we have met when he was Prime Minister of the UK in the European Council Summit in Edinburgh. I was, at that time, Foreign Minister of my country. I was asked to discuss with you Europe, and so let me tell you where I believe Europe is and where I believe Europe is going to be. And the best thing is to think about the experience we had recently. And you'll not be surprised that I will base my considerations precisely on my experience. I was indeed President of the European Commission for 2004-2014. In 2004, the European Union had 15 members, 15 countries. Today, it has 28. Today, in the euro area, there are 19 members. So we have today in the euro area more members than we had before in the European Union. I'm saying that because I know it may seem counterintuitive, but in fact, Europe today is stronger than before. Some people, including in Europe, are attained by what I call the intellectual glamour of pessimism. They want to show that they are intelligent, predicting the worst every time they meet. But the reality is that in spite of the crisis, or precisely because of the crisis, the European Union has been enlarging and has been integrating. Today, we have more competences in the European Union than before. Today, we have a banking union, certainly not perfect, certainly not completed. But if you have asked most of my predecessors, do you believe today there will be a banking union with direct powers of supervision for the European Central Bank over the banks of the euro area? People say probably not. It's not possible. It's not thinkable. But today we have it. So my point is the following. Please, when you make an analysis about the European Union, don't just look at the news of the day. Look at the medium term. Compare a kind of a series of time and not just one moment. Because naturally, if you look at the day, it will be about crisis, it will be about discussions, because Europe is a rather complex situation to be. 28 countries, 28 democracies. It's not easy to find accommodation, to find a compromise. But at the end, there is an agreement. And that agreement works. I'm no longer in office, so I really want you to know that what I'm telling you is what I believe. My level of sincerity is increasing day by day. Today I'm saying exactly what I think. It's not in contradiction with what I was saying before, but I can be more explicit about it. So yes, I think we have shown during these years the extraordinary resilience of the European Union and of the euro area. In fact, the crisis we had was not technically a crisis of the euro area. It has exposed serious flaws in the euro area, that's true. Some of them have been addressed. But it was a financial crisis, first of all, that, by the way, did not start in Europe. And it was a sovereign debt crisis of some of our countries. So it was not created by the euro. It was created by some kind of behavior in financial markets that had an effect also in some of our countries, and by irresponsible behavior of some governments that accepted extremely high levels of debt. And this has been, or is being, corrected. So I really believe that the problems we have are still there. We have serious political and social problems still in Europe. But I think the resilience that the European Union and the euro area have shown allow us to be confident about the future. In fact, all the revisions in terms of growth have been, the projections in terms of growth are being revised upwards. Recently, the ECB has made it as well. It's not going to be spectacular growth, no. It's going to be growth around between 1.5% to 2% this year, and probably more next year. I think we have a situation in Europe where we believe that we may have a kind of a paradox, the economics getting better and politics getting worse. Why do I say this? Because there is some time gap between the macroeconomic improvement in Europe and the common feeling of the citizens, so-called citizens in the street. They are not yet feeling the benefits of the improvement of the macroeconomic situation. Unemployment remains extremely high in some of our member states. And also because we may have political risks. There are political risks, and accidents may happen. What are the political risks? If you look at the short and medium term, possibility of the default or Grexit, I think it's still a possibility, even if I believe it's not going to happen. A possible exit of the UK of the European Union, I believe it will not happen, but we have to consider that possibility in the scenarios we make. And of course, there are political risks in terms of the development of some populistic, sometimes extremist parties, parties from the extreme right, sometimes to the left, that are becoming, to some extent, what we call anti-systemic parties. I also believe that this can be contained. And in fact, the news that we received today from what happened yesterday in the vote in France and also in Spain are encouraging. And then, of course, there are also geopolitical risks, namely the situation of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. This is a very serious problem that I'm afraid it's going to be there for some time, where I believe Europe had no other alternative than to be very firm, because we have to think about what the alternative will be if in face of Russia intervention in Ukraine, Europe was doing nothing. So this situation is not pleasant. Nobody in Europe wanted this situation to happen. But we have to think what will be the alternative if Europe pretends that nothing was happening in Ukraine. So apart from that, we also have, of course, the risks of ISIS and this kind of extremism, fundamentalism, and that we see attacking not only Europe, by the way, attacking other parts of the world, including Russia and China. We have this risk. At the same time, I believe now there is a determination to face this situation. Basically, the reasons why I'm more confident than most analysts regarding Europe has to do with the improvement of the macroeconomic situation. For instance, the external balance of the European Union. European Union countries, if you consider it aggregate, there is a surplus, and that has been increasing. I believe the position of the ECB has been the right one. I support quantitative easing decisions. In fact, one of the things that is helping European economic recovery is the value of the euro. That is an intended consequence of the quantitative easing that is allowing Europe to export more. And in fact, Europe has, even before the quantitative easing, Europe already had a surplus in everything except energy and raw materials, because, I mean, in energy and raw materials, Europe, of course, has not is sufficient to be competitive there. But if you look in goods, industrial goods, in services, and in agricultural and agro-industrial products, Europe has a considerable surplus. And this surplus is increasing. I believe regarding unemployment, we have a problem there because it takes time to translate this improvement of the macroeconomic situation in terms of the employment figures. Having said that, I believe there are sufficient instruments to cope with the political and social situation. Europe has shown its resilience. Situations are going to be solved, as usually, by what sometimes in America we call muddling through. But that's the way Europe is. You cannot expect a union of 28 countries, 19 members now in the euro area, to take a spectacular decision one day from the other. The same applies to Greece. Just today there will be a meeting in Berlin between Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Tsipras of Greece. Let's hope that they will make some progress. I personally believe that today the euro area is much better equipped and prepared to face any possible accident in one of our members. That was not the situation before. If you look today at the situation of Ireland, Spain, Portugal, the other countries that had some kind of adjustment program, they are among the best performers. Ireland is probably the best performer today. So this contradicts some kind of vision saying that austerity is responsible for the bad situation in Europe. This is simply not true. Some of the countries that took the most courageous steps in terms of fiscal rigor are exactly the ones who are doing better today. And some of those who did not take are those who are doing less well. But today, generally speaking in Europe, with different levels of commitment, there is an understanding, and that came clearly after the financial crisis, that we need to do more in terms of structural reform. Reform is the name of the game, certainly with different levels of engagement and commitment. But if you look at the reforms made by the countries in the program in terms of labor market reform, product reform, administration, reform of the public administration, and also reforms of the tax system, it's really impressive. It's really impressive. It's almost revolutionary in some of those countries, if you compare how they were and how they are now. Others have to do more. Typically, people speak about France and Italy, but even there, Prime Minister Renzi took important measures, in some cases breaking a taboo. They are making some kind of reform in their political system and administrative system, and in fact they have changed one totemic article of the labor market system. And also France is now starting to address some issues that happened with the so-called legislation Macron being the name of the economics minister, that is being supported clearly by Prime Minister Valls. So I really believe that this is what Europe has to do now. Not to change the political, the commitment to fiscal rigor. I believe it will be a mistake now to have some kind of expansionary fiscal policy in Europe. Some countries can do it, but others simply cannot do it. We don't need the same kind of growth we had before the crisis. Let's not forget that we had the crisis precisely because of that, because of lack of fiscal rigor in some of our countries. What we need to support aggregate demand, and certainly aggregate demand needs to be supported, is the countries with margin to do more. By the way, Germany is starting to do it. Germany is a big ship. It takes some time for Germany to change, but it's changing. If you look at the evolution of the wages in Germany, we see that Germany is already changing. That is okay. Support aggregate demand for the countries who have the fiscal space. But to give the advice to countries who simply do not have the fiscal space to expand, I believe would be a mistake. So what can we do for growth? That's the question. It can come through structural reform, labor market reform, product reform, administration, education, medium term. Where Europe is lagging behind some of the competitors in innovation, that's one of the problems we have today in Europe. That's probably also linked to the demographic trends in Europe and to other aspects. But basically, Europe has a capacity to overcome this relatively small growth we are facing today and to go back to sustainable growth. Last but not least, trade. Trade that, by the way, we have been promoting. I was very proud during my time in office when, unfortunately, it was not possible to conclude the Doha development round because others were not ready, not because Europe was not ready. We have launched many free trade agreements. We have concluded from Singapore to Canada. We have launched with Japan. We are now discussing with America the TTIP. I think it will be critically important, not only for the United States and Europe economies, but also for the world if we conclude transatlantic trade and investment partnership. And with China, we are also making progress. If you look at the evolution of the trade in goods and the services and also in investment, but also we are now discussing with China an investment agreement. And this investment agreement, if it is concluded, can open the way for a possible free trade agreement, apart from other agreements that we have concluded with different Latin American countries. So trade can be also a source of growth. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have reasons to be confident with Europe. I'm not saying we should be optimistic in an uncritical way. As I've said, problems remain, accidents may happen, but I really believe today we have sufficiently political resolution, political determination to face those problems. The European Commission is, to some extent, the engine room of Europe. And in those 10 years I was leading the European Commission, in direct contact not only with my colleagues of the European Council, the heads of state and government of the European Union, but also with our partners outside, I've got the conviction that Europe may be sometimes frustratingly incremental, frustrating slow, adaptive, but at the end we make that decision. So that's why I wanted to convey, and I think you can trust, because I'm no longer in office, a word of confidence in Europe, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Let me tell you how we're going to proceed from now on. I'm going to ask the President one or two questions, and then the floor will be open to you. I would be grateful if they could be questions, not statements, so we can get as much in as possible. And if you could wait for the microphones to arrive so that everyone can properly hear your question, I think that would add to everyone's enjoyment of the session. José, thank you very much indeed. You expressed a great deal of confidence in the future of Europe. Can I just ask you a couple of questions about that? The Eurozone has had a tough time over the last decade in terms of growth. Given the structural reforms that are emerging and the improvements we are now beginning to see in the southern indebted countries, when do you think the European Union as a whole, and particularly the Eurozone, is going to return to a 2.5% to 3% growth that will enable unemployment to significantly fall?
A former British Prime Minister, not you, said once, in politics we should always have goals, policy goals, and timing, but it's very difficult to have both at the same time. So I know the direction is the right one. In terms of timing, I'm afraid I cannot give you an honest answer. I believe we are going to attain 2% this year or next year. 3%, I'm not sure we are going to be there in 2016, 2017. I don't think so. I'm not sure. And as I said, there are too many political risks. So, to be very honest and objective with you, the trend is positive, but how far it will take to have growth at Europe's potential, it's not yet clear. It depends on decisions that are going to be taken, that need to be taken, and this is the point. One thing is certain from my point of view. We are not going to see the same kind of growth we saw before the financial crisis. And we have to adapt to that, not only in Europe, by the way. The world has changed dramatically. It's no longer going to be like before. The Chinese, and not only the Chinese, they speak now about a new normal. The new normal after the financial crisis is not the normal before the financial crisis. And we have to adapt to this situation. But frankly, with 2 or 2.5% growth, Europe, it's not bad. The situation in Europe. Some people ask, how is it possible that Europe or some countries in Europe are living with such high levels of unemployment? One of the reasons is that those people prefer to be unemployment in Europe than go back to their countries. They are not Europeans. Look at Spain. Something that the statistics usually don't say, that many of those unemployed people are from Central America and Latin America. They earn more in unemployment benefits in Europe, in Spain, that they will earn if they were working in their countries. That's the reality. Europe has a generous, probably too generous from some points of view, system of welfare that explains why it can live with so relatively high levels of unemployed people. Because welfare, you can be in unemployment in some countries 1.5 years and receive almost all your salary. This is not what happens in the United States or in Asia, but it happens in Europe. So just to understand that the situation in Europe has some kind of let's say, stabilizers that we don't find in other parts of the world. I would prefer, of course, Europe to be growing at more spectacular figures, but frankly, we cannot predict when this kind of growth is going to happen.
Let me follow that last point up because it's extremely interesting. Given that Europe has these welfare costs, and given that Europe has a higher taxation level generally than the United States or Asia, are you worried about Europe losing its competitiveness increasingly against competitiveness from China, from Asia, and from the United States?
I think Europe is regaining competitiveness. And in fact, the reforms taken in the last years have been for more competitiveness. Not only the spectacular changes of the countries and the program, from Ireland to Portugal and Spain, but generally speaking, if you look at Europe, almost all countries have now changed the retirement age. They are doing more to have more women at work. There are more flexible regulations in terms of labor market, but it's going to be, as I said, incremental and at different spaces. The issue of the taxation is a very complex issue. Some of the most performing countries in Europe have a relatively high level of taxation. The Nordic countries. The Nordic countries have a taxation above the average in Europe, and they are among the most competitive in the world. In fact, they are some of the richest countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita, from Denmark to Sweden. So the problem is not the level of taxation itself. The problem is a mix of policies that may explain how a country is or not competitive. But basically, Europe is gaining competitiveness. By the way, if you look in historic terms, if you look at the last 20 years, what we see is that some countries in Europe have lost competitiveness, others have gained. I mean, Germany is probably the country that has benefited the most, I mean, only compared with China, with globalization. I mean, so it's true that France, Italy, and UK, by the way, in the last 20 years have lost in terms of market share. But Germany, the new member states like Poland, the Netherlands, and others have gained market share. So if you look in aggregate terms, the United States have lost more than Europe, European Union. That's the reality. And Japan also has lost more. So this is important, because when we speak about Europe, we have to understand that Europe is a very complex issue. It's not one country. In fact, there are many countries, and some have adapted better than others. But today in Europe, I think there is a great awareness of the need to become more competitive, and at different paces, certainly, there is the conscience that we have to do more to reform our economies. So I think they have even the welfare state. Europeans do not want to give up on the welfare state. In Europe, we have what the treaties call social market economy, and I don't think there is political consensus to change it. I mean, even a country like Britain, as you know, I mean, National Health Service, I mean, it's part of the, of the AIC, of what we don't want to. But it's possible to make reforms to make them more efficient, yes. And that is what I believe most of the European countries are now doing.
You mentioned when you spoke that many people wouldn't have imagined Europe could create a banking union, albeit imperfect, and they've done that. But there's a lot of dissatisfaction on the streets that's produced these far-right parties and some extraordinary demonstrations in different parts of Europe. Do you accept the proposition that the Eurozone is going to have to integrate further in the future if the euro is going to thrive in the future? And how is that going to be achievable when there is so much negative feeling in so many states that most states seem fearful of any treaty change because they don't think they could get a referendum through their country to endorse that treaty change? How are they going to move forward?
That is exactly the problem, and I think we are completely right. But first of all, as I said before, look at the trend. Today, the European Union is more integrated euro area in institutional terms than before. I remember when I first used the word expression, banking union, in fact it was doing an interview to the Financial Times, at least two of my colleagues, two prime ministers, colleagues of the European Council called me and said, you cannot speak about banking union because this is not in the treaty. And I said, no, it's not in the treaty, but to fulfill the goals of the treaty, we need a banking union. And now, basically, we have a banking union. So isn't it an instinct that in spite of all the skepticism, all the negativism, it was possible to have unanimously, a decision to give the European Central Bank direct powers of supervision? And the same with the fiscal compact. The fiscal compact, it was not possible. So fiscal compact is for more, let's say, strict rules in terms of fiscal policy. To change the treaties in Europe, we need unanimity. But it was not possible to have the fiscal treaty approved because UK opposed. There was only another country that was opposing with UK, it was the Czech Republic. So what happened? All the other countries, they approved the treaty, intergovernmental treaty, to allow the fiscal treaty to be enforced. That's what in Europe sometimes we call variable geometry. And by the way, the treaties allow for enhanced cooperation. If a minimum of 9 countries are ready to do it, they can do it. So I hope that is not going to happen. I prefer decisions taken unanimously. But if needed, the countries that are ready to go a step further, they can do it. It's allowed by the treaties. Now, regarding the euro area, I believe we need more integration in the euro area. Why? Because at the end, the credibility, the solidity of a currency depends on the credibility and solidity of the institutional political construct behind it. I remember in the most acute moments of the crisis, and we had very difficult moments in 2011, 2012, in the G20, when speaking with our partners from the United States to China to India to Brazil, and also speaking with people in the market, the question I was receiving the most was not about the deficit of Greece. The questions I was receiving the most were two, indeed. Do you believe Germany is going to support it? And secondly, do you believe there is sufficient political commitment to the currency? And my answer was always yes. And I really believe, and I want to share this with you, I believe Germany is going to do whatever is necessary to support the euro because they have made that strategic decision. It's also certainly in the interest of Germany. And I believe there is sufficient political will to keep the common currency. For instance, it's interesting that even in Greece, in spite of all the difficulties and hardship, a huge majority of the Greek people sustain the euro. And that's one of the interesting things in the current negotiations, is that the government has received a mandate to alleviate some of the conditions, but also a mandate to keep Greece in the euro, you see? So my point is that we need more integration in the euro. To be honest and to be fair, the British government, with David Cameron, while not being an enthusiastic of the euro, that everybody knows, that's out of question to have Britain in the euro for the foreseeable future at least, but they have been supporting the integration of the euro. They say you need more integration if you want to have a common currency. So it's going to be gradual, but Germany supports it very clearly. There is now already some work done. In fact, the Commission, I was proud to share, presented a document called The Blueprint for a Deep and Genuine Economic and Monetary Union, and the so-called four presidents present also some proposals. It was the President of the European Council, myself as Commission President, but also Mario Draghi as President of the ECB, and Jean-Claude Juncker, at that time, he was the President of the Eurogroup. So there is now a kind of a feuille de route, a roadmap for further steps in integration. They are going to happen sooner or later, but of course, the real risk is exactly what you, John, said. Is there political conditions? I think the mainstream parties have understood that they need to fight for that. And that's why I was happy with the elections yesterday in France. Many people were predicting the victory of the extreme right, a party that is against the euro, the Front National, and in fact, a party, one of the parties, let's say, of the European consensus, won. And let's see. But politically, yes. To be honest, to answer you very frankly and honestly, there are some risks there. But I hope that we are going to overcome those risks.
I hope so. Right, let's have some questions from the floor. Who would like to begin? Over there, first question.
Gentlemen, you both have some experience of negotiating with the Commission from one side or the other. Can I ask both of you what advice you would give to Mr. Cameron about negotiating with the Commission over the next 2 years?
Jose.
I think you should be the, I mean, at least in Britain, you are much better expert than myself.
Well, I had a lot of experience of negotiating with the Commission on previous occasions, or negotiating with our partners as well as the Commission. It isn't just the Commission, of course. And I think the first and best advice you can give David Cameron is to negotiate in private and not by megaphone. Megaphone diplomacy simply entrenches positions on both sides. And the way to reach an agreement in Europe is to talk to your European partners privately, find out where there are areas of agreement, where you can bring together a number of nations who have the same objectives of you, and build a constituency for the change you wish to see. That is both a sensible way to negotiate and, in my past experience, the most productive way to negotiate. But of course, the only other thing I would say about advice to David Cameron is I would always give it in private.
I fully agree with the wise advice of Sir John. Let me just tell you the following. First of all, negotiation is not with the Commission for the revision of the treaty. Something that it's important to note. The masters of the treaties are the member states. The Commission has a very important role in the European Union, but it's certainly not the Commission, the institution that has a decisive role there, the member states. The treaties, including the current ones, were negotiated, signed, and ratified by all member states, including Britain. The current treaty was ratified by the British Parliament. It was never imposed on Britain, neither by the Commission nor by any other power. So if Britain now wants to reformulate it, it certainly has the right to make proposals. But first of all, it should understand that they were the ones who signed it. So they have to have a very strong argument to change it. All the other members of the European Union, I can tell you, by experience, they want Britain to remain in the European Union. This is very sincere. And I really believe it will be a mistake for Europe or for Britain if there was a kind of UK exit of the European Union. And I believe that at the end that is not going to happen. I have a great confidence in the wisdom and the pragmatism of the British citizens. So in case there is a referendum. So the only advice I can give to Prime Minister Cameron, in fact I already gave it when I was in office, is not to put unrealistic demands. For instance, freedom of movement is a sacred principle in the European Union. That will never be accepted by the other countries to put that in question, namely some of new member states for them, for instance, like Poland. And Germany will never be able to accept that if, for instance, because Germany cares about this issue also because of the sensitivities of new member states, namely Poland. But if it is, for instance, to fight against the abuse of the social welfare in Britain, that is a good point, and that is perfectly doable. So if there are realistic demands, I'm sure the other members of the European Union are ready to listen attentively to the Prime Minister of Britain, because there is a deep interest of all the partners to keep Britain as a very important member of the European Union. Britain has brought a lot to the European Union. I'm not just saying that here with my good friend John Major. It was during his presidency that we have negotiated, for instance, that financial program, I remember well, in Edinburgh. But also, I mean, the commitment to the internal market, Lord Cockfield. Margaret Thatcher, that was considered not to be very enthusiastic about Europe, but she gave a lot. The vision of the enlarged Europe was to a large extent put forward by Margaret Thatcher. And by the way, Britain has extremely goodwill with all the new member states. It should not lose that goodwill. From Poland to Hungary to Czech Republic, all those countries remember well that it was Britain, one of the greatest supporters of enlargement. Why should now Britain lose that goodwill of these countries? So I really believe that if this is the spirit, we can find a solution, and that we can have, in case there is a referendum in Britain, of course, it's still to be seen, I think we can have the support. But as always in Europe, it's about compromise, compromise in the good sense of the word. So to find something of accommodation where nobody's completely happy, but at the end, it's something that can work.
I should say sometimes there are linguistic difficulties in negotiation. I remember one of José's predecessors, Jacques Delors, and when he and I first met, we decided that his broken English was better than my broken French. And so we discussed matters in English, and he talked about Europe, and he talked about someone called Douglas, who knew everything there was about Europe. If we all followed Douglas, all would be well. And I thought to myself, who is this wretched Dutchman? And after a while, it turned out he was talking about Douglas Hurd, the British Foreign Secretary. Let's take the next question. Yes, over there. I can just see a sleeve.
Thank you. With the drop in peripheral borrowing rates, your own Portugal has gone from 14% to under 2%. Is it perhaps a signal? When do we get a market signal that the time for fiscal restraint might be over and that Europe might do something like in general, cut taxes or do something to create some fiscal stimulus to go along with the monetary stimulus that we're having to get out of the low growth phase?
I don't think, for instance, Portugal is my country, as you probably know. I don't think the fiscal stimulus in Portugal now will help. Frankly, I don't think. I think what Portugal and the other countries affected should do is more good to go on with the structural reforms, become more competitive. They have done a lot of fiscal, let's say, accommodation already. It was great. I mean, if you look at the situation of Portugal 2 years ago, it was dramatic. They could not have access to the markets. The same happened in Ireland. To some extent in Spain. Spain, there was an adjustment program only for the banks, but nevertheless, Italy was very close to a disaster. I remember in G20, the discussions we had in the margin of G20 in Cannes, in France, in 2011. But precisely it was because of the front-loaded fiscal adjustment that confidence came back. Some people think, oh, it was a statement of Mr. Draghi. Sorry. It was very important, and by the way, we fully supported the positions of DCB and Draghi himself, a brilliant banker. But the decisions of DCB will not have been taken if there was not a fiscal consolidation. By the way, every time we invited the president of DCB to come to our European Council, that was the first thing he was saying, I can only do more when you commit to fiscal consolidation. That's why people have to understand that it was not a statement that created confidence in the markets. It was a set of complex measures, a policy mix that was with fiscal rigor, commitment to structural reform, and of course, sub-monetary announcements, and now sub-monetary policies. And this is important. The European Central Bank is an independent institution, but an institution that acts in the system. And this is important to understand. So that's why I continue to think that Europe has done right. Okay, we can discuss the pace. I would have preferred the curves of adjustment to be slower. But when we have designed adjustment programs, we had to take in consideration also how much money the countries were ready to put for that program. And so we had to design, together with the IMF, the so-called debt sustainability analysis, how much time it will going to take. So for a country like Portugal, I will certainly not advise now to go for a fiscal stimulus. I think they should keep what they have done. That allows Portugal now to borrow at better conditions than the United States or Ireland. I mean, it wasn't thinkable some years before. Now, what they need to do more is in terms of their commitment to structural reforms. For instance, in public administration, some issues still in the labor market. That's what can increase the competitiveness of those countries. But certainly not by a fiscal stimulus that, as we have seen in the past, only created problems. Look, when I was prime minister, the debt of Portugal was 56.7% of GDP. And afterwards it went 125% with a socialist government. Was that intelligent? What is that fiscal stimulus brought? Only problems with the markets. Only problems in terms of confidence. No, certainly. Let's not commit the same mistakes again. Countries that have margins, they can do it. Countries that are still looked at critically by markets should keep fiscal rigor for the time being.
Thank you very much. Right. Question perhaps from this side of the... No? Yep, okay. Just here. This may be the last one.
Good afternoon. I'm hearing from you that you are supporting structural reform over fiscal subsidies. Can you explain why the Greek government is fighting so hard against structural reform and more fiscal stimulus?
I believe it's for political ideological reasons. Basically, this government was against the economic policy of Europe in general. Let's not forget that this government basically comes from the Communist Party. The name is different, but it was the former Communist Party. They are against market economy, basically. They are now in a learning process. They started by being against the euro, now they are in favor of the euro. They started by asking for a haircut, now they understood that it is not going to work. But basically it's ideological resistance. I hope that an accommodation is going to be found. I think there has been some progress on the language on the side of the Greek government. I also hope that the partners, the other countries, are ready to make some gesture to Greece. It's true that the Greek people went through extremely difficult moments, hardship. But these difficulties of Greece were not provoked by Europe, as some people say in Greece. It was provoked by irresponsible behavior of the Greek government. The Greek governments, in fact, it happened while I was in the Commission, they presented false statistics. The figures they were reporting were not accurate. We, Commission, we have proposed at that time to give more powers to Eurostat. It's the official statistics, the Office for Statistics of the European Union. We were not allowed to do that, not by Greece, by other countries, that they said it was too many powers for the European Union. But afterwards, in my second mandate, they gave the European Union the instruments, and now the Eurostat, the official statistic, the Office for Statistics of the European Union, has the power to go and to control the accounts of each of our member states. And that allows us to correct things. So, in fact, the situation of Greece is a result of unsustainable debt that was created by the Greek government, mismanagement of their public finances, huge problems with tax evasion and tax fraud, problems of the administration. They have been corrected. Just to give an example, because that we can say in the European Union. In the European Union, as you know, we have the structural funds, so it's a kind of redistribution of funds for the poorest regions of Europe. And we can compare how well different countries perform. Greece was one of the worst 3 or 4 years ago. Now it's the 5th better because they've made reforms supported by the European Union. So it can change. There is nothing that condemns Greece to be in a difficult situation. There are reforms they can make, and they are as able as any other country to do, provided they make the right choices. But in fact, it was not Europe that created the situation in Greece. It was Greece that was almost bankrupt, as the other countries, by the way, and Greece asked the support of the European partners to sustain them, to go back to be able to finance themselves. And so I really believe that's the ideological difficulty that exists in the Greek government to understand that the best way for Greece to recover the confidence of the markets is, in fact, to go on with the structural reforms that Greece has committed to. Another thing important to understand for the euro area is the following. The euro area today, it's, I repeat, 19 countries. Decisions are taken unanimously. The decisions regarding the euro area, contrary to what we see sometimes in the media, they were never taken by the Troika, by the Commission, by the ECB, or by the IMF. The decisions were taken unanimously by the members of the euro area. Governments of the right, governments of the left, governments of the center. And so, if the government of Greece wants these decisions to change, he has to convince the others. He cannot put himself in a position, I have a mandate for my country, you have to change. No, decisions were taken unanimously. And this is the process in which we are now, a dialogue between a new government that has another mandate, trying to convince partners. But as always in Europe, it has to be a negotiation. And we are in the process of that negotiation. I believe it's possible to avoid a default in Greece. I really believe so. That is, let's call it the central scenario. But that requires the Greek government to give clear commitments to reform and not to think that they can do it with an economic policy that is simply in contradiction with the principles of a market economy.
I think we could probably go on for a long time on Greece and Ukraine and all sorts of other European-related matters, but I fear the clock has beaten us. So I'd like on your behalf to thank President Barroso for speaking and answering questions so honestly, clearly and concisely and enabling us to cover so much ground. Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you all for being here.